Now, also by the mid to late 17th century, you started to see colonial economies emerge based on various different factors. Some of them geographic, some of them regional, some of them out of necessity. Just kind of depends. You see a rise in consumerism, you see a rise in commercialism, and you see some deeply ingrained cultural aspects that really kind of affect the United States today. Okay, beginning of which though you see a central role of slavery in largely agrarian colonies. The South, for example. In the South, you saw a heavy abundance of tobacco and sugar growth. All of those required a substantial amount of labor, especially because in warmer climates there could be more of a year round type aspect to it. Tobacco was especially prevalent because, well, many Europeans had a massive taking to tobacco. So you have demand back in Europe itself, and you have access to a cheap labor force in the form of slaves. Then also you have foodstuffs such as rice. That's often a forgotten colonial agricultural output product. Rice was largely grown in the tidal backwaters of the Carolinas and Georgia, and it required a different type of labor. Growing rice and rice paddies is also quite labor intensive, and oftentimes slaves from particular regions of Africa were particularly targeted, largely because there were pockets in Western Africa where there may be regionally grown rice. And you may have Africans who actually knew how to grow rice and do something about it. So when they were forced over here, they were basically planted in the tidal backwaters of the Carolinas. So you have tobacco, rice, and of course sugar that really drove the southern economy. And in the north, as I mentioned in the last video, you had slaves up north, especially. There's a common misnomer that there weren't slaves in the north. There were slaves in the north. And around this time, New England was a popular destination for slaves. It's just up north, the regional growing output, especially in the rocky outcrops in northern New England, were not conducive to large scale agriculture. Even in southern New England, you had agriculture, but you also had a different economy that started to emerge. We'll talk about that in a second. So the slaves that largely worked in the northern economies worked as laborers or often even as tradesmen, crafters, um, maybe working in a domestic type situation, things along those lines. They were far more likely to have that sort of role than what you might find in the South. Now, also in the North, because it was difficult to develop large scale agriculture, there had to be other things that provided economic output. And one of the many things that the North has is, well, a lot of seaports that had been established by that point. And then also, you have closer access to England itself. So, from that standpoint, you have maybe not a large commercial farming system, but you would, however, produce a large commercial economy um, based on trade. You're trading, you're sending goods, you're sending merchant stuffs. There's a fishing industry that exists out there. You're building various different artisanry type works that you can exchange back with Europe. You have natural resources that exist in various different parts of the colonies that can be mined and molded into various different metal works and iron works. You have a strong metal industry that begins to take shape around this time. And whenever you have iron works or metal works or anything else of the sort, you develop a commercial and localized economy based upon trading metal and sending it across the Atlantic Ocean. So you have seaports, you have hunting, yeah, you do have some agricultural output, but otherwise, though, you have large scale commercial economic output that is conducive for trading across the Atlantic Ocean. That's something that's different than the North. So the North didn't have that large agricultural economy, as I mentioned, but they did have other large scale things along those lines. So because you have more ironworks, you're more likely to have various different artisans, entrepreneurs selling various different metal works. You're going to have cabinet makers, silversmiths, maybe even printers, anything else along those lines. You're going to have, you'll probably even have rifle makers, knife makers, cobblers, blacksmiths. You have all kinds of stuff like that. That's not going to happen as often in the southern economy, but it will in the north. So you have a massive commercial opportunity that paves the way for the colonists to trade back home with England, but then also have a merchant lifestyle back in the colonies itself. So you start to develop a commercial class. We're going to talk about that in a second. Otherwise, though, you do have others who live based off of a subsistence lifestyle. These are folks that don't live in urban areas, they don't trade commercially, they exist in a situation where they're self-reliant. They may have a plot of land, they grow their own food, they have their own livestock, they can produce their own milk and other goods. So they're less dependent upon larger areas. So oftentimes that self-reliance is somewhat romanticized in American history. Some historians argue back and forth that it's kind of a myth that people actually did that because they were too poor to actually own any goods that can actually produce anything self-serving. But the reality was that there was a lot of poverty in the colonies. You have a lot of colonials that don't have much to their name, even if they lived, quote unquote, near a commercial economy. And so the idea of self-sufficiency is true, but also a little bit of a half-truth as well. Okay, so you got to kind of keep that in line with a grain of salt. But one of the things that did enter into the American mindset at this time was extraction of natural resources. Okay, so you'll wait for History 1302 and the Progressive Era with Teddy Roosevelt to talk about just how that might be conserved. Okay, foreshadowing. Okay, otherwise, though, there was an emerging commercial economy, especially in the North. The problem also is that there are various different obstacles to commercial trade. And some of those obstacles centered around England itself wanting a monopoly on stuff coming out of the colonies. And if you think about it, in a mercantile system, the economy exists for the good of the home country. Okay? So there are various different limitations, some of which perhaps could have been the weather itself. Okay? But then also you have, well, there used to be a fur trade in the colonies in the early days, but that sort of subsided. Part of that may have been they killed off all the animals. That's definitely something to have possibly considered. There wasn't really any currency, so it's kind of hard to trade when you don't have reliable currency, and there was hardly any gold or silver in the colonies. So oftentimes the colonists would rely on a barter system that may not always be an equal one for one. So they didn't really have reliable currency. They didn't have a whole lot of gold or silver, and they had an inexact barter system in play. Those are some major barriers to trade around that time. Other things going on around that time were the goods themselves being sent back across the Atlantic Ocean. You developed a various different trade where American goods, raw materials if you will, would be sent to England, and then Europeans themselves would go to Africa to get slaves, and then they would bring them back to the Caribbean and therefore eventually North American continent, where everything would repeat. You have this sort of a triangle of the Americas to England, England to Africa, and Africa to the Americas, and so on and so forth. Okay, you would have various different raw materials like sugar to make rum in the Caribbean. You had tobacco that would be sent off and processed in England, smoked by Englishmen and things along those lines, people that way. So those are the types of things that made trade difficult, but there had to be people that procured all these raw materials, that had to ship and sell all these raw materials, and then employ people to do laborious work for them. So, because of all this commerce that was starting to develop in the colony, you now started to develop more of a merchant class, a business class of people who are going to start developing business wealth. So you have business mindedness with folks who are savvy, but then also take advantage of the situation offered. Okay, so at the time, you have that merchant class that started to build a little bit more of an elite status. And you have various different navigation acts that back home in Britain forbade the colonies from trading elsewhere around the world outside of Britain itself, and that just centered contact in a merchant class among North American colonists themselves. Okay, so those are some other things that helped to establish a colonial economy. Now, you also had a rise in consumer goods. If you've ever wondered how America seems to have this hunger for material goods. We like buying our phones. We like our TVs. We like our laptops. We like Jordans. We like all kinds of different things. That was ingrained early in American society as you started to see people in the 17th century develop various different economic output and income because of their trade and because of their lifestyle. You started to see a rise in social classes, kind of the haves and have-nots rather. And it became somewhat of a status symbol to where if you're a have, you're going to obtain more goods. You're going to obtain more of your precious china dishes. You're going to have satin dolls. You're going to have silver spoons. You're going to have certain things that are going to form a sense of status among the colonists. And there will be people who have none of that. So what you're starting to see is a differentiation in social classes. You have wealthier class who starts to develop a sense of refinement, a little bit more gentlemanly, noble, if you will. So from that standpoint, you have a gentry of people who have, and they're a little bit more refined, and they can buy books and read and educate themselves, that sort of a thing. Then you have everyone else, us schmucks like me, okay? Okay, so that's something that develops. Now you have this idea of social refinement, and with it comes the idea that you're going to consume things and you're going to buy things. And the more you have, the better status you have. So you have a refined society that had more resources, more power, more clout. They had access to various different publications that kept them connected to elite society back home in England itself, self portraits, fashionable items, um, gardens, anything else of the sort that was lavish, including wardrobes. So you might have a landed gentleman who has an elaborate wardrobe. And generally, you can tell back then who was very wealthy and who wasn't. Just look at their clothes. Okay? Kind of like today, right? All right? You see a guy walking around wearing Jordans. That's a symbol. Okay. You see someone walking around with beat up shoes. That's also a symbol in a different way. Okay? So you start to see a desire for consumer goods, a consumer culture started to ingrain in the colonials, and then also you started to see a striation in society among the haves and haves not. The wealthy who obtained virtue and refinement and material, and then you had everyone else who was just struggling to get by. Okay? So, that is the rise of consumerism in the colonial economy. That's how you have some rise and striations in society, the differentiation in some of the slaves, and various different things that affect the United States to this day.